Colossians chapter 3. We are picking up in verse 24, but that's in the middle of a sentence, so we want to make sure and understand what just came before it. In verse 22, we entered this smaller section in which we find the second big idea in the practical. So when you saw in Colossians 3:17 that what he was doing was using that as an extension of what he had already said in Colossians 2:6 and 7, in building up essentially there the ideas of both doctrine and character that he addressed in chapters 2 and the first half of chapter 3, all coming together under our worship together in verse 16. But then verse 17 is there to emphasize as a transition that he's not just dealing with doctrinal and collective elements when he's talking about the gospel, but it applies to all of life. And he says that in verse 17, but then that it's connected to what he is then saying in the application that follows. So the first thing he did in verses 18 through 21 was talk about the home, that everything in the gospel is designed to reach and to apply and to be real in the home. But in verse 22, he takes the next step from that and say it's also true in work. And so we began looking at verses 22 and 23, which gets down to the motive of work and how he's applying this to people who were literal slaves in their day. Now, not everybody was. You know, he's going to talk slaves and masters because everybody's going to fall within those two extremes. And so you end up with an understanding of what your responsibilities and how you should see things within that framework. And that's what I want you to recognize as we go through. So he starts by saying in verse 22, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. Do what your boss says. Not with eye service as men pleasers. Not just when he's around, not just when people are looking, but you work in sincerity of heart. That is, or singleness. Focused on I'm doing my job and I care about my job. Why? Because I have a God who's watching me. And I respect him. And I am in awe of him and revere him. That then produces what is found in verse 23. And whatever you do, and notice the similarity of what he says in verse 23 with what he said in verse 17. On the whatever you do, well, he brings that back in. Whatever you do, do it heartily. Now, that's the sincerity of heart. So that is, you get that and give it your all. This is what we talked about. You work out of soul, deeply motivated and energetic to move into what needs to be done. But here's the key, as to the Lord and not to men. So in these two verses, he's tried to change your perspective about your job. He's acknowledged you have a boss. Okay, if you're an employee, you have a boss. But he says, I don't want you to just see it that way. Your work should not be done just simply for doing the job and for the boss, but you are doing something through that. You should be seeking to please God in the process. Now, that flow matters because it changes how you work. It automatically establishes that if your boss tells you something to do that would be contrary to what the Lord would want you to do, you already know what you're going to do. Because you're looking above his head from the very beginning, right? You're already over there. He's telling you to do these things, but the Lord is the one that matters first. But in your regular job and doing these things, you should be also working for him because I want you to think about the implication. What does that imply about you in your job of why the Lord would want you doing this? What does it say? An intentionally vague question. Okay, you hit on something important here. Okay, Saria, you're hitting on something important here, which has to do with the difference of how you end up being motivated when things are difficult with a difficult boss. You know, Charlotte? Okay, good. Okay, so I like this because we covered both sides of it. Is that when you're working for the Lord, the motivation that you have extends beyond those walls. Okay, that's the first thing. And that can be very important, right? Depending upon what your job is or just having a down day, it can be very important. You know, one of those things, and to step away from this for a moment, one of the great things that was done, and particularly in World War II, was how people were told why their job mattered for the war effort. Okay? And one particular example of this was the seamstresses involved in sewing together a parachute. But when you're told how well you do your job, how well this is sewn together, will make the difference between life or death of a soldier going in who's going to be dropped into a war zone wearing this parachute that you stitched together. Now, what has just happened? First of all, we're not just running a sewing machine anymore, are we? We're doing something that matters. And there are greater stakes than what I ever thought before. High stakes. And you know what else? You are part of what's going on in that war effort too. They accomplished all of that by simply helping these people who were doing this work understand how they were connected, how their participation and good effort would make a difference down the road. Now, I want you to take that idea and realize what Paul has just done for you. You can look at your work and you say, well, I don't know that, my particular work is going to save lives. Okay? But you're not supposed to be looking just at your work. It's how you work. All right? How you work and the influence you have by how you work can make a huge difference. Because now, going back to Charlotte's point, now what we're doing is I've got a higher purpose in my work than just, putting widgets together. Right? Because the how I work has made what I do a lesser thing in many ways to matter. The how matters. Whatever job you have, when you do it for the Lord, fearing the Lord, seeking to please the Lord, your purpose is not simply producing something, it's showing others the Lord in the process. That's what he's just taught us.
David,
Yes, sir.
when you get around the holidays, a lot of people slough off. If you continue to work, they'll give you a hard time, but you're doing it for God.
You're doing it for God. Yeah. It makes me, you just depressed me though by saying that people slough off work around the holidays. I would think we'd all be happy and cheerful. It's too busy, you got other things to do. Yeah. But if we've got our other thing to do is pleasing God, it changes things. Okay? Now let's notice what he does with this next, because he's going to build on this. Verse 24. Knowing that, or having perceived, that is, you're realizing something here, that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. Now, there's something going on here with an unstated contrast in comparison. So when he says, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, what's on the other end of this that he is not saying specifically? Why are you working your job? Now, he's talking to slaves, okay? Okay. The idea of the slaves, you could get as a slave, they would sometimes get bonuses, things that they could do, and they could have basically a little spending money here and there. He says, the thing that matters is what the Lord has to give you. You will receive the word. And he uses the word that basically as a payment. Okay, for the word reward. It's not the normal word. So here you go. And that's where he describes it. What kind of reward is this? A reward of inheritance. Okay, I'm curious about this. Has anybody here ever received something of an inheritance from your boss? Now, no, you joke, but I asked a question once, and I had someone come later. Oh, I did. Yeah, well, go speak up. It's okay. And that's not a very likely outcome, now, is it? That you're going to have your boss is going to put you in his will. I mean, if so, then you must be a great employee. if that's the case, okay. But he's putting these two opposites. Says, what should you value more? What anything you're getting out of it that's physical and monetary? What's the bigger thing? It's whatever the Lord's going to give you. And he's going to more than compensate you for the work you're doing. Tracy? Yeah, no, that's right. If y'all didn't hear, the whole idea is inheritance is typically family. You are to be working for him, and you're his child. So you would get inheritance, but it's also, Tracy's word, the family business. So you're putting all this effort in to say, whoever's doing this out here, you need to change how you think of it. I'm still working for my Lord, even while I do this, and I'm trying to show the right things as I work, but also by doing it the right way, I'm looking to not just a paycheck at the end of the week or month, I'm looking to the inheritance at the end of life. And that changes how I see what I'm about and what I'm willing to do in the context of how I do it. For you serve the Lord Christ. The word serve there, guess what? It's serve as a slave. So he just flipped by starting with bondservants and says, you know whose bondservants you actually are? Mine. Not Paul, the Lord's. You're the Lord's bondservants. And think about how often Paul calls himself that. He's there to do whatever the Lord wants. And once you accept that, and here's what he wants you to do on this job, now I'm doing it because this is what he wants me to do. Not because of, some Roman telling me to do. I'm doing this because of what God wants me to do. And does it have to be funneled through what some, secular employer might say? Yeah. But it doesn't matter what he thinks. It's about the way you think about it that matters more because of how God thinks. John? Mm-hmm. No, that's right. The example of Philemon paired with this is powerful because it is sent to the same place at the same time, and it's a specific instance of this with one being the master, one being the slave that are involved in this, with Paul being the intermediary. And so to be able to say this, you have both sides. Here's what you do right now, and later he in Philemon talks about what we should work toward when you take this mindset of what you're really all about, it also will change that relationship. Okay? But then he closes with the underbelly of it all with verse 25. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Okay. Now there's a relationship between the idea of the one who is, when it says he does wrong, that's committed in a general sense unrighteousness. And then he will be repaid, and that is basically righteousness exacted for him in regard to he didn't do his job. Because righteousness is an understanding of there's a standard. So you have the one who failed to meet the standard will be called to reckon for failing to meet the standard, is what this wording means. Okay? So he who does wrong will be repaid for what he's done. And then he says, and there is no partiality. Deal with the first part, because now I said it's that underbelly of all this, is there's a flip side to this. Okay? He's presented, here's what you do. You just do what you're supposed to do. But if you're one of those and you're gonna do wrong, well, what falls under doing wrong in this situation? He is dealing with slavery, okay? But you're doing wrong. Where's the contrast with this? What is the wrongdoing that is in mind? Well, specifically, I think you could even start with not doing your job, not doing what you're told. So you come in, you're a slave, your job is to do what you're told. And so when you do wrong, and that is you do not regard whatever the standard said of what is expected of you, then there are going to be consequences. And notice why I think it's important he waited to the end to bring that up. Because he does not want you to be motivated in your work based upon negative consequences. He wants your motivation to be positive spiritual desire. This is included, though, to say, don't go running to God for pity when you end up having some consequences when you didn't do what you're supposed to do in the first place. And that's why when it says, and there is no partiality comes in. That is, when there's a standard set, okay, again, these derivatives of justice, okay, vengeance, that all these words have, there's a standard of what is there. Get it right. Do it right. Okay. So he puts that down and say, why would someone who did wrong expect good treatment? Why would they expect partiality? And what is partiality? Favoritism, good. Literally, it means to welcome the face. That is, who it is matters. So we come in and I see you, and so you get one standard and the other person gets a different standard because I don't know them. Okay, Roger?
We spoke about what family is earlier. But there's a sense in what some family members portray and think, I deserve this. They didn't work for it, but I deserve this because my name is.
Yeah, I think that's right. The idea of it being expecting, because it is the family business and I'm related, that I ought to get something, that because I'm a child of God, then I ought to get off for this, or something like this. Think about the difference of, like, if you are the something Paul used elsewhere, but the son and versus a servant in the business, and the servant working hard, and the son just kind of being walking around and thinking that he can get by just on that when he's supposed to be there to work. And God's kind of saying, no, there are consequences, based upon what you're doing. And so understanding that, he's wanting to kind of now lift up and say, I'm not bailing you out on wrongdoing. You're going to have to face the consequences. So there's not any kind of situation where it's going to be okay because I'm just going to take care of it for you, right? So understand that what it means in work. Again, this is a slave situation. If you don't blame God when you didn't do your work. He's not looking at you and saying, I've got a different set of standards for you. You've got to do the work. Okay. Now this is one of those unfortunate chapter breaks because he's going to now flip in chapter 4 and coming up in verse 1, and you're going to end up with a very different thing coming on because there's no partiality is a great segue into what he's about to say on the other side of this when he says, Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair. I want you to note both of those words. What is just and fair. Knowing that you also have a master in heaven. The word just is related to the words just above it of he who does wrong and repaid. It's the positive version of that word. Okay? So he is putting that together and saying, okay, you just said you servants, you need to respond and meet up to what the standards set by your boss are. And then he turns it around and say, okay, boss, you need to recognize that standard too and be fair about it. The statement of fairness, I would say, it's the opposite of partiality. Okay? So he's telling them, I'm telling them to work and to go about it and do exactly what they're told to do and to not expect some kind of favorable treatment. Think in the first century, if your boss is a Christian and you're serving him, do you think you're going to get better treatment than the non-Christian you're working with? That would be favoritism, wouldn't it? That'd be partiality. Nah, we're not playing that game. That's what he's saying. But now let's flip it around and says, okay, bosses, masters, the word is lords. He's going to make a play on that in just a second. You're lords. You're in charge of something. That's what that means. When he says, give your bondservants what is just and fair, is it so that what they receive matches up? Again, it's the opposite of what he just dealt with. The transition is beautiful because you do what's right by your employees. You set the standard. You told them this is what they would get paid essentially or what you do, and you follow through on it. Don't be, okay, the biblical example is don't be a Laban. All right, let's anybody remember what happened in Genesis when Jacob goes off and he works for Laban? That's about the most unfair business practice as a boss you can have. You ever think you're really treated poorly? Go look at what he did to Jacob. I mean, we remember what he did in swapping out daughters, right, based upon 7 years worth of work. That was the first thing. He also changed his wages multiple times throughout their whole history together. He just kept changing because God was favoring Jacob. And so Laban kind of tried to keep working it around to where he could get more of the cut. And that's what he was dealing with. He says, we're not having any of that. You do what's fair, be upfront. And then the word fair is pretty close to maybe equitable, but it's based on no partiality, meaning the standards are the same, the expectations are the same. Okay, so you don't go in and lay down and have this layered system based upon your favorites of how you treat people who are your employees. Stephanie. Yeah. Right. Yes, it's the same thing. When we talked about the home, one of the last things I said was, your responsibility is not to make your spouse fulfill their role. Your job is to do your role. Okay? Same thing here. You don't base what you do as an employee on how good your boss is. Why? Because your ultimate boss is God. And here he tells the bosses, you don't base what you do based upon the employees. You set the standards and you follow through on it, because that's how God does it. And that's why he follows through with saying, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. You should follow, and the implication is, you as a boss should be following my example for how to treat people. Does God have expectations? Yes. Is he upfront about them? Yes. Is he fair with them? Yes. Does he want everyone to do well? Yes. Are there consequences when you don't? Yes. But notice that he didn't even go into that specifically here. Now, we find other places deal with this more specifically, say in 1 Peter 2. But the emphasis he's trying to make here for the Colossians is understanding that whatever position you're in, there are principles by which you should work. Now, what's interesting today, as we think about applying this, is we have a lot of people in the economy who are both. Right? That is, they answer to somebody and they also have people who answer to them, right? Let me introduce you to the joys of mid-level management. Okay. So, I see some notes of recognition from the crowd. Is that you are both in a situation of where you have certain things here that on the employee side you need to recognize, and what you're doing there needs to be done. What you're told, but you need to be looking greater ways to God, who you're trying to please and how you do it. But you also have people who are listening to you. You need to make sure that in your role, in whatever management role of dealing with people, that you're being fair in treatment and treating them properly and equitable, and that there's no kind of discrimination in that process either. You don't want it on this side, you should not give it out on the other side. Okay? And you think about there are different reasons for it. You know, some historically are ethnicity driven. Some are driven by, we go back to family or friends kind of think that they always get the preferential treatment in something. Those kind of things. As Christian, now I'm going to flip this around and say, does that mean that if you own a business, is it wrong to look for Christians to hire? A quiet fell over the auditorium. You want Christians, why? They should be doing a better job, right? Yeah. So that should be something that you would want. But it also is a higher standard. And it doesn't mean you are immediately putting anybody out. It just that would be a good working environment. And that would be something that you would want. Now you're in a tricky situation. Okay, here you go, but does that mean you're going to exclude other people on business practices who apply when it's all equal? What if that person is more qualified? No. Yeah, no. We've got you figured out already. It depends on whether or not. By the way, it depends on what the job is for, right? You didn't check the text and then the law library. My point is, overall, it's sometimes can be trickier than we think, because you go in and you're doing this. I mean, what are your standards for this? I mean, like, if I'm going to hire a teacher, guess what? They've got to meet just not just be a Christian, but a certain kind of Christian with certain kind of background, right? That's the hiring practice. These are set. Okay. But not everyone is doing that kind of job. But you don't want to, obviously, you're not going to break a law doing it, though. You need to make sure you're not breaking a law. So the nature of the favoritism is more in the treatment about what they're doing more than anything. Okay. But the whole idea of the master, what he's saying by being just and fair, is how you're treating people on the job, too. That's where the emphasis is are you treating people as people who are working hard for you? And when there's a failure, are you acknowledging that failure and addressing it? Or does it depend on who your friends are? Well, that's not right. Okay, friends, family, we need to make sure and address that. Okay, so that's core foundation here. Now, we're going to go ahead and move on to introduce this next section. Uh-oh. What if I just kind of, pretend John Dunn's there, can I move on? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you need to make sure the standard is a standard, right? Yeah, and don't say that, well, you ought to do this for me and make it about that too. Yeah, no, that's very true. All right, now we're going to move into what is the last section. He's moving outward still with these practical applications, and notice what he has done. We've got the home, we've got the workplace, and now you have this interesting kind of segue. We'll read it first, but then I want you to see what's actually going on. Apostle Paul writes, "Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak." What I find interesting, why I went ahead and read the verses 3 and 4 with this, is when he says, meanwhile praying also for us, then doesn't that say something about what his expectation is when he says continue earnestly in prayer? Who is being prayed for in those instances? Because he's saying the expectation is, I'm asking for something specific to me. So who is the continue earnestly in prayer, New King James? What is that prayer about? Say that louder. The congregation. Or you could say for you, okay? For you as an individual or you, the congregation, and now beyond that. I think you're right. And so he starts the idea of continue. It's the idea, or persevere, means to beat forward. Keep on at it. Okay? And the nature of that reminds me of the persistent widow. And I think that's important because the whole idea is of praying for something like this helps us understand what being vigilant in it with thanksgiving is talking about. Okay? So, first of all, keep on praying. There's the context here. I want you to think, well, sure. I mean, you pray without ceasing. Okay. Why? Let me suggest one reason why I brought up the persistent widow. Does God give you everything you asked for the first time you ask? No. Continue earnestly in prayer. The nature of that wording is important, I think. That is, you just keep on at it. If you know, and there are certain parameters for prayer, right? Meaning from James chapter 1 is you need to ask in faith, verse 5. And then later on in James, you need to not ask amiss, meaning you need to ask for the right things. And in 1 John 5, essentially, you need to ask those things that are in accordance with his will. So it needs to be, what we're asking for is not like, Santa, give me a new truck for Christmas. That's not what we're talking about. Here is what God's will is, and we should be asking for things that are in concert with that. Now, that can cover a lot of things, lots of wonderful things. We don't always know what God's will is going to be about something. Say for someone's health, we don't always know. Do we pray about it? Well, yeah. We just don't know. But we do understand that's the parameter for what we ought to do and what we ought to focus on. So once we have that lined up, that we're asking in faith, and that we believe that God is listening and can do this, and we're asking in accordance with his will, so that we're not asking amiss, we're not asking selfishly, we're not asking for things that are, just stuff. We're asking for things that are beneficial in the spiritual outlook of what God wants. And Paul's about to give us an example of that. But this phrase he does here, being vigilant in it. Well, in what? What's the it? Prayer. So you're praying, you need to be vigilant in prayer. What does it mean to be vigilant in prayer? The word is the idea of like a guard on duty who's out here scanning the horizon looking for stuff. He's up and at them. About what? About prayer? But if you're going to be, you're already praying, you got that, but you're going to be vigilant. So it's like, I'm going to start a fight here. This is good. Okay, Stephanie, hold on. Okay. Now there's constant faith in the process then, that God's capable of it. Okay. How about this? How about that you're looking for the answer? You're looking for the answer. If you are continuing instant in prayer, continuing earnestly in prayer, you really believe, because I think all these comments are good, you are convinced, you know that what God can do. How many times do we leave the prayer and the content of the prayer at the prayer? And that we are, instead of expecting something. The old illustration is don't pray for rain. If you're going to pray for rain, make sure you carry an umbrella. Okay? Well, why? Well, what were you praying for rain for if you don't expect God that might answer that? You don't know for sure. You don't know for sure. But what? If you're so convinced it's not going to happen, why did you pray for it? That's not really praying in faith, is it? Okay. So he's combining a couple of things here. The continuing earnestly, that one word of beating forward, is an expression of faith. Why else would you keep praying unless you believed what God could do something about it? There's an understanding of what you do, but also being vigilant in it. And that is, there's an expectation to it. And your eyes open looking around. That's the image that he's creating. That God answers prayer. So why are you persistent in prayer? Because you have faith God answers prayer. That's why. Now look at the last thing he says. With thanksgiving. You see the connection now? Now he has made this pathway of prayer, which is all the way from the diligence and effort given because you have faith in God, to the expectation, to the gratitude. He just taught you 3 different things that ought to be essential in your prayer life. the faith that keeps on, the faith that looks expectantly for the answer, and a faith that appreciates when God gives me the answer I wanted. Gratitude. If we only emphasize the first, we're leaving out some things important about prayer. You may be praying for something for a long time you never get, right? That's going to happen. You know why? Because God knows best. Sometimes, God knew better than that. And so you don't get it. That doesn't discount prayer, because we understand that we need prayer, and prayer is valuable because of all that we don't know and can't do that God knows and can do. It's understanding that how vast that difference is between us that makes prayer such a wonderful blessing. Now, we don't have time to go into it in detail, but I want to just start the process. When he says, meanwhile, praying also for us. Isn't it amazing that the Apostle Paul, by the way he worded this, prioritized their prayers for them over their prayers for him? Paul gave himself a meanwhile. Right? By the way, everybody, when you do this, can I ask a favor? Could you pray for me too? And when he asks for a prayer and asks, could you pray for me too, he's given us an example of the type of prayer we ought to be praying. Now, this is just one example. It's not like this is every prayer. But it gives us, in principle, all those things we were looking at earlier. Why? That God would open to us a door for the Word. Here's what he was praying. He was praying for opportunities to preach. He's in prison. He is in prison, and he is praying for opportunities, however that may work out, that he can teach people the Word. A door for the Word. I want you to think about, okay, we're done. Okay. I want you to leave with this. I want you to think about Paul in a prison. If you've ever seen a picture of a Roman prison, they weren't open. There weren't bars in the same way. It was dark, it was musty, and you had a small opening. That's the door. And he, in prison, would have been looking at doors where he had any contact with anything that mattered, Christian or otherwise, was there. And he's looking for a door that when the door is open, he could do something with the gospel. We'll pick up there next week.